As a child, I always had access to a shortwave radio. I used to listen to the BBC World Service about the Middle East. I also loved the music from that part of the world and was probably listening to the Quran being recited, but I didn't know that at the time. As I grew up, I continued to listen to the BBC World Service. At the time, they had a program called Words of Faith in which a different religious speaker would talk for 5 to 8 minutes every weekday, representing all the main religions in the UK. Of all the speakers, the Muslims were the ones I most enjoyed listening to. Every time the Muslim representative spoke, I wanted to know more about Islam. My impression of the religion was that the person who practices Islam is happy, not like the bad people portrayed by the American media. I refused to believe that people who loved Allah so much could be like those portrayed by the media. As I come from a Jewish background, what united me to Islam was the belief that Allah has no partners. Working in the UK, an important time in my life came when I met a real Muslim, but I didn't know it yet. I was working in computer programming in New York State when I felt a great urge to visit the UK. I visited London and loved it. During my visit, I went to several employment agencies without having any luck. One of the agencies gave me several business magazines. When I returned to the United States, I started sending more CVs to the companies and other agencies listed in the magazines. I came back to the UK because one of the companies wanted to interview me. So I started visiting more companies and agencies until I got a position, even though I was on a tourist visa. The company that hired me applied for a work visa for me, and the personnel department told me that I had to leave the country for the paperwork to be processed. Once again, I returned to the United States. Another agency obtained a temporary work visa and employed me for a company called Logotech, which at the time was based in Egham, Surrey. Meeting a real Muslim for the first time sometime after I started working at Logotech, I discovered that my supervisor, Anis Karim, was Muslim. I asked him if he knew how I could get a copy of the Quran. To my surprise, he obtained a copy of the Quran for me within a few days. He also asked me to promise that I would take a bath before reading the Quran, and that I would never show it to anyone who might make blasphemous comments about it. The next day, I took my morning shower and made my breakfast. While I was eating breakfast, I started reading. I later found out that reading was what Allah ordered the angel Gabriel to instruct our prophet to do, even though he couldn't read or write. Well, words can't describe how I felt when I read just a small part of the holiest book in the world. It only took 10 pages when, at that point, I told myself that this religion was for me. It was around 1990. The more I read, the more I wanted to know, and I loved what I was reading. At the time, I knew nothing about how to pray or any details of Islam. If Anis had invited me to the mosque in London, I would have gone with him. The only thing I knew about praying to Allah was the position of prostration. At the time, I knew that Muslims prayed several times a day, so I started doing it at night before going to bed and in the morning when I woke up. Back in the United States, when my work visa expired, I had to return to the United States and was unemployed for several years. I visited my father in Huntsville, Alabama, and created a database application for him. I saw that Huntsville was a cosmopolitan high-tech city and decided to try for a position as a programmer. My father told me that if I didn't get a job, I would have to go back to my mother in New Jersey. A fortnight before returning to New Jersey, I got a job as a programmer at a company in Huntsville. My first trip to a mosque, my sister and I were planning a trip to Indonesia because we had a friend we made online. My sister asked me if I could help her find some Islamic jewelry to bring back as a gift. At the time, I had no idea that there were Muslims in Huntsville. Then Allah put things right for me. I remembered that there was a store called Crescent Imports, which I thought was run by Muslims. It wasn't. It was run by the group called the Nation of Islam. Here's the strange part that only Allah could have arranged. We spoke to the store owner and told him we wanted to find Islamic jewelry. He referred us to the Islamic Center of Huntsville. I thank Allah that they directed me to the mosque. We went to the building, but there was only one car parked there. I spoke to the man in the car and he told us that we should speak to the imam about where to find the jewel. I was still afraid to enter the building because, for me, it was a holy place. I remembered one day when I saw a lady at work wearing a hijab. I told her about accepting Islam personally and she said, "Why don't you visit the mosque in Huntsville?" I finally went back to the mosque after gathering enough courage to enter the holy place. I spoke to the imam and he invited me to pray with the Muslim brothers. That was a turning point in my life. I loved it and started visiting the mosque once a week in the evening. Then I started visiting it several times a week in the evening. The urge to come more often was stronger and now I performed most of my prayers in the mosque, except for the Asr and Maghrib prayers when I was at work. I officially accepted Islam in November 1996. I publicly made my Shahada. I pray Zuhr and Asr alone or with other Muslim brothers in a small mosque at my workplace. I proudly carry my prayer mat around the corridors of my work in an attempt to get people to ask me what it is. When they ask, I tell them that I am a Muslim and that I use the mat to pray. My desktop, including my computer, is decorated with Islamic illustrations. My background on my computer is usually the Kaaba or our mosque. Now that I'm a Muslim, there's no going back to unbelief.